Good afternoon, friends. It's my privilege to be here with you all today to speak about an issue of considerable contemporary importance. We are going to be spending the next 1 hour or so looking at statutory regulatory authorities in India. The idea is to give you all an overview of authorities that have been constituted by law to do regulation primarily of economic activities. With that background, let me give you a gist of the central message of my presentation. The key points to note are, in the last many years, in particular in the last 4 or 5 decades, more so in the last 3 decades, the Indian economy, especially the macro economy, has changed substantially. There is much greater market orientation of the Indian economy than we had before this change, and broadly the experts agree that the change begins seriously in a quantum way from the early 90s. So much more market orientation than before. When we say market orientation, it is important to keep in mind a lesson from our basic public economics, which is that typically in most areas of human endeavor, markets work well. And this rule applies also in India. When we say markets work well, what is normally meant is primarily what is problems associated and continues for himself, and the word monopoly or oligopoly. So situations where one economic agent, it could be a producer, it could be a distributor, it could be a consumer, when one economic agent exercises market power, that will lead to a situation of market failure. Second example, or second category more correctly, of categories of market failures is something called externalities. Externalities, typically the examples given are negative, but in theory externalities can be positive or negative. Here I have given the example of a negative externality. We are all familiar with thermal power stations. In Delhi there is one. I'm sure in the cities that you people live in, there are thermal power stations. Recently, as many of you would recall, these power stations, which are coal-fired typically, have also attracted a lot of attention in the context of the climate change discussions. But the area that I want to focus on is a factory. In this case, I've taken the example of a thermal power producer, typically will emit pollution, and that pollution in turn has consequences depending on how far the pollution, whether it is dust, particles, carbon or other forms of gases, depending on how far from the factory this travels, it will cause illness. It can cause respiratory illness, it can cause skin-related allergies, it can cause a number of health-related problems. Now, there is a factory which is producing, let's say, electricity or chemicals or something else. That factory is generating pollution. That pollution is causing the health-related consequences that I mentioned a minute ago. But in purely commercial terms, in costing terms, the factory that is causing the pollution, in its books of accounts, in its calculation, does not take note of the cost that it causes to the bystanders, to the neighborhood where people are falling sick. So let's say X living in the neighborhood of a factory has a maker. We took the example of a tea maker in Saket. Let's assume that beyond tea, he is also selling biscuits or bun or some other edible items along with tea. Now, when you or I go to have a cup of tea there, we can see the tea being made. The tea is boiling, the milk is fresh, He's adding everything in our presence. So we have some assurance about the quality of the tea that is being given to us. But the bread or the biscuit or some other edible item that he's giving us, he is opening some packet or opening a drawer and handing over that stuff to us. We don't know the quality. Unless the quality is certified, we have no means of knowing, is it good quality bread? Is it fresh bread? Is it made with pure or impure ingredients? So there is information asymmetry, in this case, between the seller of the tea slash bread or biscuit and the purchaser, namely you or me. When there is information asymmetry, economic transactions will not happen. The information asymmetry in this case relating to quality of the food products means that the purchaser will not end up buying it. This causes market failure. The fourth category of market failure is what is called public goods. Public goods in economics, as distinct from routine English, in economics has a clear fixed meaning. It means a good or a service which has two characteristics. It should be non-rival, it should be non-excludable. In other words, if I am consuming something, no one else can consume it. In that sense, it is rival. Two, if it belongs to me, I should be able to exclude others from consuming it. But when a good or a service displays these two characteristics, non-rival and non-excludable, it is called a public good. For instance, if there is clean air, we will assume that a lot of the good policy measures being put in place by the government work, and Delhi has good clean air for all of us to breathe. A new child, a child born after the air is cleaned up, will also get the benefit of this clean air. In that sense, clean air is non-rival, non-excludable. You can't say this child has not paid tax or this child is not a voter and hence this child cannot breathe clean air. Even if somebody wants, he or she cannot change these two characteristics, non-rivalry, non-excludability, because of which clean air typically is a good example of a public good. Likewise, defense services, likewise, security services provided by the law agencies, the police, etc. These are standard examples of public goods. To conclude, four classes of market failures: market power, externalities, asymmetric information, and public goods. Now, with this, what is it that the state should do? The simple point being made now is these four market failures should help us think about the role of the state in the economy. In an ideal analytical world, the state should only pursue these four market failures. But we know that the world we live in will have a lot of implementation difficulties. The practical world is never exactly what the analytical world that we see in the textbooks is. There will also be social, political considerations, and hence in the real world there will be other reasons why the state intervenes in the economy. But I think in an analytical sense, we should be clear that addressing market failures gives us the ideal notion of a state as far as its role in the economy is concerned. After having agreed that the role of the state emanates from market failure and to correct market failure, there is a 3-step public policy process that I want to place before you. This 3-step process is largely based on an excellent book called In Service of the Republic. It's a public policy textbook written by a very well-known public servant, very highly regarded economist, Dr. Vijay Kelkar. So Kelkar and Shah have written a book where they mention this 3-step process. The first step is, in keeping with what I have already said, identify the market failure. Once we see a market failure, identify the precise intervention where we will use the power of the state to address that precise market failure. Third, do we have the capacity? And when we say we, I am talking about the state. Does the state have the ability to undertake the intervention that I mentioned in step 2, the intervention that will address the market failure? So quickly, 3-step process: identify the market failure. Number 2, identify the precise intervention where state power will be used to address the market failure, keeping in mind all along the third point, does the state machinery, have the ability to undertake the intervention that we spoke about. Here I will very briefly mention, but I will not elaborate. We need to keep in mind what are the difficult tasks in public policy, difficult tasks in any government. There is a 3-fold classification that is employed and normally attributed to a well-known economist from Harvard University called Lant Pritchett. Lant Pritchett used 3 test criteria to classify difficult versus non-difficult tasks in government. Test 1. Does the task or the activity in government that we are talking about, does it involve discretion? You all know the meaning of discretion. Discretion means making a judgment based on some facts. And the example that is often given is polio vaccination involves zero discretion. Every child should be protected against polio. So a government program which is a polio vaccination program involves no discretion. Identify every child and there is a certain period within which the vaccination has to be administered. Second test is, are there numerous transactions? In the case of polio vaccination, typically there is only one polio shot. Some forms of vaccination involve a second or a booster shot, but it is not numerous transactions. 3, are the stakes very high? Lant Pritchett employs this 3-fold classification to conclude that the normal activities of the state, particularly 4 categories of actions: justice delivery system, within that criminal justice delivery; second, financial regulation; 3, tax policy. If you break down justice into normal or civil justice and criminal justice, 2 activities there: financial regulation, tax policy, as being the most complex tasks of government. These are Lant Pritchett's classification based on the 3-fold criteria. Lant also draws attention to another fact, which is, remember, finally, if you remove all the layers, what is government? Government is a series of people. It could be functionaries of the field, it is government servants, it is politicians, and we must keep in mind what public choice theory tells us, which is that government is humans consisting of politicians, officials, other functionaries who are also all self-interested actors. And self-interested actors will ordinarily, exceptions apart, will not be maximizing social welfare, but will be maximizing or optimizing self goals or personal welfare. So the additional point that Lant Pritchard makes in the discussion on the role of the state is keeping in mind the fact that governments are a series of human beings or a large number of human beings who are self-interested actors. Ensure that there is alignment between the objectives of the individual and the objectives of the organization, in this case the government. Typically this alignment is very difficult. It's a very serious design activity that has to be undertaken consciously. In the absence of that, Lant Pritchard's point is, keep in mind public choice theory that governments consists of a series of humans who are self-interested actors. In the field of public policy, there are essentially only three things that a government can do. One that we are all familiar with, it can tax. Two, it can use the money collected by taxation to do public expenditure. So A, tax, B, spend. But the first point in the bullet is modify behavior. Government can, by its actions, when government says such and such a conduct A or conduct B will be punishable, what is it saying? It is telling you and me that if you do this prohibited conduct, then you will be given a punishment. So, what is the consequence? You and I, fearing that punishment, will shun or avoid that conduct. It has modified our behavior. For example, if you jump a traffic signal, the policeman can impose a fine on you. If you repeatedly jump traffic signals, the policeman can not only fine you, he can also prosecute you. Bigger traffic offenses can even lead to some other higher, stiffer forms of punishment. So therefore, behavior earlier was, I don't worry about traffic signals, I just run through all traffic signals, unmindful of safety of others. But by a law that says this kind of behavior will be penalized, government is modifying the behavior of citizens. So, to summarize, three possibilities. Government, by its laws or by other instruments, can demand, create an organization in which legislative as well as executive functions are both combined and placed in that organization. Example here is the writing of the law is the legislative function, and executive functions are licensing, investigation, prosecution under that law, and this is typically what we call a type 1 regulator. A type 1 regulator is two functions of the state, legislative functions and executive functions. On the other hand, there are many regulators, including the SEBI and more recently the IBBI, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, which are set up as what I call, or what some of the textbooks call, a type 2 regulator. In the type 2 regulator, we have legislative functions, we have executive functions, and we have some judicial functions. And the problem that will immediately strike you if you are a student of constitutional law, the thing that will strike you is that we have violated an important principle of constitution called separation of powers. We today have many regulators, and I have illustrated here a list of regulators: Reserve Bank of India, SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA. IRDA stands for Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority. PFRDA is Pension Funds Regulatory Development Authority. Competition Commission of India, I mentioned IBBI. Then there is the International Financial Services Center Authority. There is the Telecom Regulatory Authority, Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, Airport Economic Regulatory Authority, Food Standards and Safety Authority of India, and a whole bunch of other professional education related bodies that are mentioned that you're familiar with. And remember, this is not an exhaustive list. How have SRAs been dealt with by the Indian judiciary? And why do I even raise this question? I raise this question because in my slide on type 2 regulator, my last bullet said, with this, the formal violation of separation of powers is complete. If separation of powers has been noticed, we need to see what has been the view of the Indian judiciary on SRAs. And I have summarized here in a very short slide a complex matter, and the summary is Indian judiciary has said statutory regulatory authorities are constitutionally permissible and they are valid. Number two, India does not have a strict separation of powers. It has a modified checks and balances system, but it does not have strict separation of powers. And hence, courts have concluded that SRAs can exercise quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative and administrative powers. They have also held that SRAs can impose monetary penalties, they can license, they can regulate, and they can supervise. SRAs and Indian judiciary, while we are talking about this, it is useful to keep in mind something that the Supreme Court has said many years ago in a judgment of 2004, which is called Clariant International Limited and another versus SEBI, where it's a long quotation, but the highlighted portions are what you and I should be focusing on. It said that the SEBI Act runs counter to the doctrine of separation of powers. However, Supreme Court said in future this could lead to several public law concerns. Currently, it is not something we are worried about, but it is a useful caution that the judiciary is not entirely comfortable. They have not said we are uncomfortable, but they are signaling that they are not entirely comfortable with an arrangement which runs counter to the doctrine of separation of powers. Before we move to reforms and way forward, we need to understand that statutory regulatory authorities are distinct from the government department, but there is a lot of interface between governments, and here I have taken Government of India because we are looking at statutory regulatory authorities of the union government. What are the points of interface? The Government of India writes the rules for eligibility, terms and conditions of appointment of the senior most personnel of the SRAs. In the case of Reserve Bank of India, for instance, appointment of governor and deputy governors is decided by Government of India in accordance with the rules that have been made under the relevant act, in this case the RBI Act. Similarly, the SEBI rules have prescriptions on eligibility, terms and conditions of appointment, which means salary, allowances, leave, then process of appointment removal, plus how will the organization called SEBI have access to public funds, because it needs money to run its activity. What will be the source of its funds? How will it apply the funds? How will SEBI interact with the parliament? How will SEBI or RBI or IRDA interact with foreign governments? Plus the entities that are owned by government. For example, I'm sure you are reading in the newspapers about LIC, Life Insurance Corporation. Now, Life Insurance Corporation is, as of today, wholly owned by the Government of India, and it is therefore a government owned entity. The point that is made in the second last bullet here. The government owned entity regulation, if it is in that domain, will also be done by the regulator. That will mean some interface between the government and the regulator. Government not necessarily in the form of the department, but the government owned entity. Besides that, there are other smaller miscellaneous matters which we need not waste time on. The area that requires serious reform is the statutory regulatory authority and Government of India interface. We need to improve and reform the appointment process for a variety of reasons. I mentioned earlier that regulators are typically in areas which require economic or other domain expertise, and to be able to source good quality domain expertise, we need an appointment process which will attract experts from the domain. And in the past, we have not been very successful. This is something we need to improve and reform. Second, the current system is monies that are collected by the statutory regulatory authority is retained by the authority except when it is penalties. This is causing problems of many kinds. On the one hand, there is the problem of inadequacy of resources for agencies and the need for independence of the agency for its own resources. On the other hand, public monies are to be accounted for and need to be looked at by Parliament and by parliamentary committees. And hence, there are suggestions on how to improve the financial related aspects of SRAs by maybe asking them to keep monies that they collect in the public account and put penalties in the CFI, Consolidated Fund of India. However, these are suggestions which are still being debated. There is no consensus. Should statutory regulatory authorities be audited and audited by the CAG in a performance review? Government departments can be audited by the constitutionally created Comptroller and Auditor General of India. Should statutory regulatory authorities also be subject to audit by the CAG? Should there be vigilance, and should the machinery called CVC look at vigilance of SRAs? How do SRAs in different spheres but which impact each other, coordinate with each other. For instance, Competition Commission of India regulates competition in all sectors, let us say including telecom. Telecom Regulatory Authority also has jurisdiction over the sector called telecommunication, including competition. So, in the limited area of competition in the telecom sector, how will the two interact with each other? What is the developmental role coordination with Government of India? Should there be better forms of accountability of SRAs, including direct accountability to Parliament? These are all the questions that a commission called FSLRC, Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, headed by a former judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Sri Krishna, went into, and it gave a wonderful report covering the 8 key elements that I have mentioned here: clarity of purpose, role of board, legislative process, executive process, judicial process, reporting, accountability, and role of government department. And it is my concluding point that we should carry forward the FSLRC attempt to all sectors and improve the regulation of activities in India by better designed SRAs. Thank you and have a good evening, all of you.